black doll body is complete and we're ready to add the hair. When you're adding the hair, the first thing you want to do is consider the style that you're going to be making. Depending on the style of hair that you choose, the way you sew it will be different. So we're going to be adding yarn hair to this doll. And I'm just going to show you how to do a full head of hair. If you want things like, a bun or braids, you might have to apply your hair a little bit differently, but I'll show you the way I like to do it. The first thing that's helpful is if you draw guidelines for where you're going to place your hair. The method I'm going to show you is quite full, so if you prefer a lighter look, not as much hair, you can do this any way you want. So I'm going to turn my doll over and I'm going to draw some guidelines for where I'm going to place my hair. The first thing I want to draw is where I want the bottom of the hairline to be. Now this is kind of a preference. You can have it end way up here if that's where you want the end of your hair to be. Perhaps if you're doing a ponytail, you may want it to be lower. I tend to like having it be pretty low. So I'm going to draw a line along the bottom edge that will represent the bottom of the hairline. I'm using a wet erase marker. You can use whichever marking tool you prefer, even a pencil. This will be covered up for the most part. If you use something like an air erase marker, this does take some time, so you may want to consider that it could vanish before you're done. So there's going to be the bottom of my hairline. I'm also going to add hair along the entire side seam, and you don't necessarily have to mark this. I'm just marking it so you can see where all of the hair placement's going to go. And if you're doing something like a bun, this may be all of the hair placement you need. I'm going to do a full head, so I'm going to have a lot more strands of hair on mine. If you want to do ponytails, I find it's helpful to run a line down the center back. That way when you pull the hair to either side, you don't see the doll skin. I like to do a row of hair about every ½ inch. I'm also going to do 2 rows of hair at the top from about this point to about that point there. So from about here to here, I'm going to do 2 rows just because I want to have some bangs hanging down, and I'll show you that once we get to that point. Once you've decided on your hairstyle and come up with general placement guidelines for your hair, you want to consider how long you want the hair to be. I'm going to measure from the top of the head down to about where I want the hair to end. On this doll, I'd like it to end about 1 inch below her dress, which is about 10 inches from the top of the head. So when I cut my strands, I'm going to double it, which would mean my strands need to be about 20 inches long. Now that's when I'm measuring from the top of the head. If the strands are placed on the bottom and they're the same length, they're going to go all the way down to her foot. So you can decide how you want to do this. You can measure each strand placement line separate and make a whole bunch of different lengths. That's kind of a lot of work for me. I don't like to do that, so I'm going to do mine like in about 3 groups. I'm going to do one measuring from the bottom, which will be about 6½ inches long. One measuring from the middle of the head, that's about 8 inches. And one measuring from the top of the head, that will be about 10. Now, if you don't want the hair to be all the same length, if you would like it to have stages to where it's short and kind of has a more layered look, you can cut them all the same. For example, let me show you on my test dolls. So I have 2 dolls here that I tested for the hair. On this one, I cut all of the hair the same length. All of the strands were cut for a 7-inch length, which means I cut them at 14 inches long. So you'll notice that the strands that are attached to the top of the head come up quite a bit shorter than the strands that were attached to the bottom. And then it has kind of a layered look. So you can see how it gradually gets longer as it goes to the bottom. And that's a great look. So if that's what you're going for, you can cut all of your strands the same length. These strands were cut from the measurement at the bottom of the head, so they get shorter as you bring them up. This one was done the same way, and then I cut it afterwards. This one doesn't have as much hair as the first doll, but again, you can see the short strands here and the longer ones down here because all the strands were cut the same length. So if that doesn't bother you, you can go ahead and do yours all the same. Once you decided your hairstyle, length, and placement, you need to start preparing your yarn. So I have my yarn here that I'm going to use for the hair. And what you may notice is when you begin pulling the yarn out of the skein here, you may notice that it is quite crinkly. This may be what you're going for if you want curly hair. I was not a fan of all of these kinks, so I did some research to figure out how I could get rid of those. So let me show you what I've learned. I'm going to make some 16-inch strands here. So I have created 2 rows of pins. I have 1 row of pins here and another here. They are 16 inches apart, and the pins are pointing away from the center. So here's where I'm going to place my yarn, and the pins are pointing outward, and I have them pinned in place here on my ironing board. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my yarn that I want to straighten, and I'm going to tie the end of the yarn around my first pin. Once that's in place, I'm going to go ahead and wrap my yarn around the other pins. And as I do this, I like to have my pins color coded. It helps me make sure I keep it in order. I'm going to pull the yarn so it's taut. I don't want it stretched out, but I want to make sure that all the little wrinkles are not present. So here we go. Let's wrap around our pins. Once you have it wrapped around your pins once, go ahead and repeat this process either 2 to 4 times, however many you're comfortable with, or for however many strands of hair you need. Once you've wrapped as much yarn as you'd like to, go ahead and tie it off again at the pin. So I have my iron set to high steam, and I'm going to steam the yarn. And then I'm going to pat it flat. Take care not to burn your hands. Also take care not to actually touch the yarn with the iron. You don't want it to melt. If your yarn is super curly, you can use a press cloth and actually press the yarn, but what happens often if you do that is that the yarn will be compressed flat. And so that can make the yarn look a little bit funny if you don't want really flat yarn. So I'm gonna do one more time. And then I'm gonna let this cool. I like to add something heavy on top of my yarn as I do this. I'm just going to pinch the ends of the yarn here where the pin was. I'm going to cut my knot and snip the loops. And I'm going to do that for each section. And I now have nice straight strands of yarn. They may not be perfectly straight. You can always stretch them and steam them again if needed, but they're usually a lot straighter than they were when you started. Grab the yarn from the center, keep hold of the center portion because that's where you'll attach it to your doll. But you now have nice straight yarn for your hair. If you're not straightening your doll hair, here's another quick way to cut the strands for your doll. If you were making 7-inch long hair, you'd cut a piece of cardboard that is 7 inches tall. Then you wrap your yarn around it. So I like to start with the yarn at the bottom. And then just simply wrap it around. Once I have as much hair as I'd like on my piece of board, then I'm going to remove the strands. So I'll just slide my fingers underneath the yarn there, get a grip, and then cut at the bottom. When you remove the board, you'll notice that you have strands that are 14 inches long, which is exactly what we needed for this project. So this is a great way to create your strands. One way to add doll hair is to create wefts. This means that you're going to put pieces or strands of the hair together before you apply it to the doll head. You don't have to do this. This again is something that's optional, but works well for a lot of people. The wefts need to be at least as long as the lines in which you're going to apply them. So these are about 4.5 inches in length on my doll. And so the first thing I'm going to do is get a piece of paper. This will help me to be able to sew my wefts together on my sewing machine. So I'm going to take my paper and my ruler, and I'm going to draw a line lengthwise. So since my paper is 8.5 inches wide, that means I need my line to be 4.25 inches from the edge. Normally I just use a pencil, but I'm using a black pen here so that you can see it. Now that I've drawn my line, I'm going to go ahead and cut my paper in half the other way. So I'm left with 2 sheets of paper that are 8.5 by 5.5 inches wide, and they have a line down the center. I've just picked up my strands of hair from the ironing board, and I've got them pinched in the middle, and I'm going to lay the center of the strands right on the line that I made. And I'm going to spread the strands out so that they're a single layer, but I don't want any gaps in between. So what we're going to do once you have these in place is you're going to take your second sheet of paper, align it with the first. You want the line to be on top so that you can see it. And we now kind of have a sandwich of hair with the hair in between our paper. And we're gonna take this to the sewing machine and we're gonna sew down this line. It's best if you can do this process right next to your sewing machine if possible, so you don't have to move it around a lot. Also, when you get to your sewing machine, you can lift this up, double check, make sure you don't have any gaps before you start sewing. So let's head over to the sewing machine. Careful not to shift the strands. I'm going to line up my line that I drew with my needle. And I would highly recommend using a coordinating color thread if possible. And you can kind of feel when you hit the yarn. So when you start, you're gonna sew this just like normal. I'm gonna use a 2.5-inch stitch length, and I'm just gonna sew across, and I am gonna make sure that I backstitch. Some people use tissue paper for this or masking tape, but I found tissue paper leaves too many little paper fringes, and masking tape can make your needle all sticky. So it's really your choice, but I prefer just to use regular paper. So here we go. I'm gonna make sure I backstitch well. So here's my favorite part. Now that the strands have been sewn, you simply tear at the stitch line. So where your needle entered the paper, just go ahead and rip. Hold the strands. Notice how nice and easy that just comes out. Every once in a while you will get little bits of paper left in there. That's okay. They tend to pick out real easy. And there we go. We now have a weft of doll hair that we can apply to our doll. Again, you can see how visible the thread is, so do use coordinating thread if you can. So you want the same number of wefts as the lines that you're going to put the hair on. Or you can attach it in individual strands if you don't want to do wefts. Sometimes I like to do individual strands, especially if I'm gonna mix and match colors and I want the colors to be in specific locations. So I'll show you both ways when I do my doll hair today. My wefts are complete and I'm ready to start adding them to my doll. If I was making a doll with ponytails, I would stitch my weft along this line first. So what you do to stitch a weft in place is you find the stitch line on your weft and you align it with the line that you drew. You can pin it in place if you like. And then you're going to hand stitch along that line. So if you're doing ponytails, go ahead and start on that line there. You can also do that line just in case if you think that you might want ponytails in the future. Sometimes, depending on how much hair you fill in elsewhere, you could even do 2 rows where you stack one weft on top of the other, but you'd want to stitch them separately. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm not doing ponytails, so I'm going to start on this bottom line right here. I'm going to line my weft with my stitch line. And I'm going to put some pins to hold it in place. So I'm just going to keep an eye on my stitch line and align it with my drawn line. And if you put the craft stick in your doll, you may want to use shorter pins if you have them. Okay, so my weft is all pinned in place. So my stitch line is attached to the doll. So let's hand stitch this in place. You're going to want to make sure you have a needle that's double threaded. and you're going to want to use coordinating thread if possible. I'm using contrasting just so you can see it, but your doll will look better in the end if you use matching thread. I'm going to hide the knot on the back of the head, and I'm going to use a back stitch to sew this in place. Go up too far, about 2 strands of hair. And then I'm going to go back 2 strands. Poke your needle up 2 strands ahead too far. And go back 2 strands. Make sure that you're going through the doll's head as you stitch this. And if you have a doll needle or a little longer needle, that can be helpful. This is a time-consuming process. It does take quite a while to attach all this hair. Go ahead, find a comfy seat, sit down in front of a good Netflix show, and hand stitch this row in place. When you get to the end of the row, make sure that you've back stitched over all of the individual strands at the end. So here's my last strand. It doesn't look like it's been stitched by hand. So I'm going to make sure that's attached. And then you can tie a really good knot and hide it. Or you can turn your weft to follow your next line. So I'm turning my weft. I'm going to continue along the line that's on the side of the face. So I'm turning my weft. I'm going to stitch along here, and then when I get to my next row, I'm going to turn again. So I'm only stitching up a few stitches to where I can get to my next spot. You can see that even with just one weft attached, she's got a good amount of hair. I'm working on my 3rd row of doll hair, and I have a little section left that I want to add strands for at a certain length, but I don't want to make another weft since it's so small. So I'm going to show you how to add the strands of hair if you are not doing wefts. So you can add your hair strand by strand, and this is just fine. So what I like to do is grab a couple strands of hair, and I will grab them from their center, and then I place the center portion on my line. And then I'll just back stitch those few strands in place. And then I'll repeat that process. So I'll grab 2 more strands from the center, place it on the line, and back stitch in place. This is a great way to do it. You can actually do the whole doll head in this manner. I've done this with one of my test dolls. I just added it strand by strand. I actually like the process of doing it this way, but it can be a bit more time consuming. It's also a great way to add the strands if you'd like to mix and match colors. So I'm going to do that a little bit later on with my doll. And so if you want to add a few strands of one color and then add a few strands of another color, this is a great way to do it. So you can kind of decide as you go what you want the hair to look like rather than having to plan it in advance. This is also a great way to add your strands if you have a few places that need reinforcement, like if there's a spot where you can see the doll's skin, or if there's a gap in your wefts. So we have a few spots that we're going to be filling that way. So if you decide not to create wefts on your sewing machine, then you can go ahead and just stitch the yarn on a few strands at a time. You can also similarly take a larger set of strands, find the middle, place it on your line, arrange them in a single layer, and you can kind of hold them with your fingers and back stitch those in place. So it's kind of the same process, it's just aligning them all up at one time instead of a couple at a time. I prefer the wefts to this method. I feel like it's a little harder to keep track of them. The nice thing about this is that you make sure that every single strand is stitched. And you make sure that every single strand is stitched to the doll, which just makes it really strong, which is nice. But it does take a little bit of effort to keep the strands in the place that you'd like them. I've added 4 rows of hair to the back of the doll, and I'm going to do something a little bit different for the next one. When I created the weft for the next row, I mixed colors of yarn. So I have 2 different colors of yarn here, all mixed up, and so it's going to give the doll hair just a little bit more texture and a little bit more contrast than if it was all one solid color. So when I add my next row, I'm going to add the different colored strands, but I'm going to apply it in the same way I did all of the others. I'm almost done stitching on the hair. I've done all of the rows in the back, adding the wefts, except for the very top one. So I'm going to do this top row strand by strand. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I'm going to be using 3 different colors, and I want to be able to place the strands where I want them and see how they look before I actually stitch them down. So I'm also going to go strand by strand, and I'm going to fill in the gaps here on the sides to make sure those aren't visible. So again, I'm going to hand stitch using a back stitch, putting those on. I've added the row of hair at the top, and I've filled in all of the gaps on the sides for my doll hair. I have one last step to do before I'm finished with the hair. On my doll, I want to have bangs, which means that this half of the strands of the hair are going to be facing forward. That leaves this part just a little bit thin, and so you can see quite a bit of the doll skin. Now, if that doesn't bother you, you can go ahead and just leave it like that and call it finished. But for me, I want to make sure that it's a little bit more covered so you don't get those accidental little peaks of doll skin in that top area here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take another layer of yarn and I'm gonna stitch right on top of this one. And I'll have all my doll hair attached. I've added a second row up at the top, and everything else is all placed where I like it. And so now she's ready for a haircut. The last step is to style the hair how you want it. You can separate it at your hairline in the back if you decided to make ponytails, and you can just tie them with another piece of yarn or ribbon to make the ponytails. You can braid it however you want. My doll is just gonna have long straight hair, so I'm just going to play with it until I get it in a position that I like, and then I'm going to trim it along the bottom. This is something that takes a lot of moving around, so I'm actually gonna hold it up above so it's hanging like this, and sometimes I'll even give it, the doll a day to sit upright so that the hair can hang freely. And so it's all in the position that it's going to be. So I'm gonna give her a haircut and then I'll come back, but you can trim it however you like. I finished cutting the hair for my doll. I wanted her hair to be just a little bit different. I wanted it to be at a steep angle, shorter on one side and longer on the other. And I think that's the joy of doll making, is you can make your hairstyle or your doll specific to whatever you like and whatever your preference is. So I'm really happy with the way her hair turned out. It was a lot of fun doing the multiple colors on this one. I'm excited to see all the dolls that everyone else can make, and so have fun. I hope you've enjoyed this ragdoll project.